Hello again, everybody. I hope you feel refreshed by the dancing girls and the wine and the bunches of grapes the Symposium provided for us. This is now your chance to ask questions, so I hope you've got lots of questions. If not, I guess I'll ask some. But before I open it up, just so that you can prepare your questions and be ready in a minute, I'm going to kick off by introducing a question that's come up on Twitter from Odd Socks Productions, who ask a very good question. Could the panel please give an opinion on the benefits of choosing a classic text over a new piece? So why not just kind of write a play about monsters and coming home from the war? I mean, what's the benefit? What do you get out of dealing with a classic text? What are the differences in between adapting a classic text and starting with your own imagination? Like, there are lots of pragmatic differences, you know, that are just to do with it's very difficult at the moment to persuade people to spend their money on new texts. However, actually, I often, one of the things that I wrote down when I was preparing to do this, but forgot to say, was I'm interested in whether Oedipus or the Oedipus complex actually came first, you know? Often, even when I'm writing something in a contemporary setting with a title that isn't a classic title, I'm always asking, what is the story I'm telling, you know? What is the hero's journey? So in some ways it is starting at a different place, but I kind of feel like the pieces that work well are often versions of sort of covert retellings of these classic tales. I often, because I work a lot with families, I'm often working with fairy tales, which are sort of like kid myth, you know. I made a lot of noise over the years about not being allowed to write new plays and getting really pissed off about it. At the moment, I'm thinking, okay, if Euripides and Shakespeare could cope with it, I can, you know. So I now think there is not a big deal. I don't need to be writing something which appears to be absolutely original. I can own these old tales. How about you, Caroline?
I was really interested in what Emma said earlier about the self and other, and that was it. That what you said?
Yes.
Yes. But that thing of like something that's feels very other from us on one level, giving us perspective on ourselves. I think that rings very true, and for me, that's something that is exciting about revisiting something and reinterpreting it. Also, I think, particularly with, I'm really interested in sort of, I suppose, collage as a way of kind of making a piece of theatre. And that's something that I've allowed Penelope to be, probably more than anything I've made before, and I've been really excited by that. So there are a lot of different writing styles and a lot of different flavours. Like, there's bits that I wanted to feel really epic and big and like it's from the world of the gods, and other bits where I wanted her to feel like a contemporary sort of teenager, and other bits where it's more of a poem. And so, but the collage extends further because it's temporal as well. You know, I'm drawing on something that's so ancient. I'm also drawing on my experiences of separation. I'm also drawing on contemporary military wives' experience of separation, and I quite like just shoving those together and leaving the audience somewhere in the gaps to go like, oh, how do I experience this? So, yeah, I guess as a modern maker, encountering that classic, I think that's a really interesting thing to engage in. Yeah.
And from the point of view of a director, Marcus, you're dealing here with a classic play. It's been done more times than we could care to mention. It has a very strong performance tradition.
you know, is there a difference in the way that you direct, approach a text as a director? If it's a new play and you've got the author in front of you, then if you've got a Sophocles play, albeit with Roy in tow, so to speak.
Making new work is always what we try to do, and don't forget, it's for an audience that hasn't seen it before. Even though there have been many audiences, I'm talking about the people who might be coming to theatre for the very first time, or might be the reluctant dragged-alongs. They're the ones who are we want to kind of ignite that spark and that flame with. And so doing something that hasn't been done before, where there isn't it's great. This is a bit like it's adapting a recipe. We know the kind of ingredients there, with the strong story elements are there, but actually we're going to sort of recreate that as a new piece of cake with putting our own stuff into it, and it's going to have a different flavour. It's going to feel a completely different way. We are also in the world, and I know that Sarah would echo this, that we want to make sure that people do feel that they have a sense of knowing something about what it is before they come and buy a ticket. It's very difficult to sell a brand new unknown piece of work in theatre as it stands at the moment. Now, it doesn't mean to say we don't do it. Of course we do, but in terms of directing something that's new. We'd like to say that there is a flavour in doing something which has a sort of a known entity, but we are able to make something completely new and a new version of it. So it's a completely new model of it. But we know the kind of the basic bones and the structures there, so we know that it works. Often when you make a piece of work, sometimes before you put it out in front of an audience, if it's a new piece, you don't even know where it works. Is it going to fly? Is it going to move along? And you only do that by putting it in front of audiences, and then it evolves over time. So the fact of doing something that gives it a new opportunity to extend the cultural DNA of our theatre tradition, but to reinvent it and to represent it in a way that is, as I say, relevant and connected, and does feel it has a possible new slant or take on it, is still as exciting and as vital to work on. Because again, the actors working on those words for the first time, Roy's poetry and Roy's words are very different, and Roy writes from the characters and the people he knows and the world in which he knows and echoes. So that for us is, again, these words haven't been said before by people. The story's been told, but not these words, and not in this way, and not in this context. So yeah, it's often, there are pragmatic as well as creative reasons why you might want to do that.
We are what's brilliant, as far as I'm concerned, seems to be the flavour that I'm guessing from all of you, is that the Greeks are among us. We are not at a great distance from these texts. We can move among them, play with them, change and adapt them, and all will be well. But is there not a sense, this might be a question for you, Sarah, that these texts can seem fantastically intimidating and unfamiliar and strange, and the Odyssey may not look to your audiences like something that they feel an absolute immediate connection with? I mean, it's an ancient Greek epic poem. So how has that worked for you here?
I suppose from a director's point of view, you start with any story saying, that's the very first question you ask, does it have resonance for my audience today? And I suppose from a directing point of view, I'm now going on the microphone for the live stream, I suppose from our point of view, it's about will our audience walk in and see something they recognise? I, as an artist, am interested in making work that can... I am an optimist, but I also think a realist. I do genuinely think theatre can change the world. And I think that you can see a piece of work and it can shift the way that you feel, it can shift you emotionally, it can shift you intellectually. And I think what happened with the Odyssey was two things. One was that I wanted to have a conversation about the consequences of war. I walked through Westfield shopping centre and on two occasions was asked to contribute, once to a charity, Help for Heroes, that I'm sure you all know, and once to our British forces. And I thought to myself, well, this is really interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm not sure how I feel about giving my money towards British forces, and what does that mean now? And I want to have that conversation with myself as an artist, but also with my audience. And then in the research, started to go, actually, these people who do go out to wars, and whether you agree with the wars or you don't agree with the wars, they do then come back into our community, and we all, that impacts on us, and how do we deal with that now? So that was of interest. So we began by looking at the Soldier's Return. Mike used as a source material a book that I know you've spoken about, Charlotte, in your writings, Odysseus in America by Dr. Jonathan Shea, if I got the title right. And that looks at the soldier's return home and uses the Odyssey as a way to describe the post-traumatic stress that soldiers go under, that experience, as they return home. And so we dug deep under the skin of that, and we spoke to ex-Royal Marines and ex-military wives and all of that, and that fueled the work that we did, so it did have relevance in that sense. But what was really interesting was that on Tuesday I sat in the auditorium with 400 young people, age 11 to 17, 18, and it was electric. It was probably one of the best, you were there, weren't you? It was probably one of the best theatre experiences I've had in 10, 15 years. It was just electric because they just got it. Partly due to Mike's writing, because it was fresh and it was engaging, and there was no fourth wall, and they were very definitely in the room and they were engaged with, but they connected to the story. They connected to the idea that this man was lost and he had to find his place again in the world, having gone through some horrendous things, and actually to be able to connect to his family and his home was difficult. And one year 8 pupil gave an entire interpretation of the book, of the play to me, which was clearly about a divorce that she had some experience of. That man and that woman don't know how to be together because they've had too much arguments going on in their lives. That was what she said to me, and I was like, wow. That's like, you know, but it was electric, and they applauded the fights, they gasped at the Cyclops, they applauded the singing, they applauded a lot of things, but they were just totally there. But they also then went to pin drop silence at the moment when Odysseus and Penelope looked each other in the eyes and said, how are we going to make this work? And that was fantastic. And so I think we need a mixed ecology, because we do need, and we must, especially in this funding ecology, economy at the moment, we must invest in new art, we must invest in new writing. And the commission to Cameron was part of that. Actually, here's an artist making exciting work, let's just support them. But we also mustn't forget that these texts are the birthright of all of us, actually. And that just because you come from a challenging school, which some of these pupils do, who maybe, you know, in today's curriculum might not get the chance to study the Odyssey in the same way that grammar school kids might have done 40, 50 years ago. Actually, those kids left that theatre going, oh yeah, I get that, I know that, I understand that text and it has relevance to me. So I think that mixed ecology of both of them is really vital, and as a director in the room, you have to constantly be asking the question, well, what does this mean now? Because to create something that's crumbling and you know, it doesn't connect to us, well, what's the point in that? Theatre needs to shift you and move you and take you somewhere else.
Thank you. Now, questions from the floor, anybody? Do we need to wait for the microphone from the floor? Yes.
Ideally, yes.
So there will be a roving microphone, marvellous. Does anyone have a question or an intervention? Because if you're too shy, I'll just carry on, but I think that would be bad.
There's a hand up
There's
over
a hand
there.
down there.
I'd like to ask this question. It seems to me that if you take an ancient Greek play and create a contemporary version of it, you've some responsibility to communicate some of the philosophical content that's in it. For example, in Antigone, we have that famous ode, wonders are many and nothing is more wonderful than man that has tamed the terrier, trimmed the hedge and learned the mysteries of the watering can. That's not quite. What I'm wondering is, could the team tell us what their attitude is to adapting the classical Greek thinking? We've heard a bit about Xenia, about the gods framework that produces the plays. What do you think about the other material in the plays, and how would you treat it?
Mike, you were talking to me earlier about feeling a sense of responsibility to Homer. Emma and I were counselling you against this because Homer had been dead for a very long time. But this is a real question.
It is a real question, and it does plague me. It plagued me all the way through the process of working on the piece, that I was being reductive, you know? and that I was, I mean, I had to cut so much that I lost a lot of wonderful stuff. Right up to the end, I lost one of my favourite pieces that I almost swore would be in it, which was the encounter that Odysseus has with his dog when he returns. His dog is the only beast in that house that actually recognises him. And I kind of felt that this was just a glorious piece of writing. The writer, Homer, had created something which, you know, nearly 3,000 years later, you know what that's about. But within the context of the actual work, we couldn't make it work, partly because the only actor available to play the dog was Telemachus, his son. And it was just too weird, so it had to go. Yeah, I know. There might be a sort of a case to be argued, but it, you know, anyway. I think it's a genuine living issue, and but either, it seems to me, in the end, I suppose I go with Sarah, that we have to make the home is still there. Here I am carrying it around with me. Look how big it is, you know, 30 hours worth, and it's still there. You can read it. Kids who come and see our version of the Odyssey, maybe down the line, in the same way as Caroline did from that teacher, might think this is a vibrant thing, this is part of our culture, it's not frightening. I might experience, you know. So I'm not answering, am I? I'm going to say yes.
You are.
It's a very long way of saying yes.
I want to put this question to Emma as well, because, you know, Emma, the questioner here referred to, you know, one of the most famous choral odes in Antigone, in the whole of Greek tragedy. It's probably one of the high points of Western thought. I mean, it's the most extraordinary piece of poetic writing. The last time I saw Antigone on the stage, it barely figured, because choral odes, in their intense poeticism, are very difficult to tackle in today's theatre, arguably. We are not, you know, it is not part of our current theatrical vocabulary to have a chorus that behaves like that. The chorus in which a lot of this philosophical material is often positioned is very hard for us to deal with. I mean, what are your feelings about that as a classicist, as a critic, as a poetic critic, as someone who sits with these texts in Greek and thinks about them? What's your position on that?
Well, I think in a way I'd want to try and have it both ways, in that I think the questioner is right to pick out the specifics, the detail, which really brings the stories to life, that you can't just reduce it to a very simple narrative, this is what happens to Antigone. You have to think about the way the story's been told and the sort of moral drive of the story, so the sort of narrative force of the story, if you will. So I think that, yes, there is a place for the very detailed focus on what we might think of as the original text, to the extent of reading through it, thinking about the detail. But ultimately what we're doing there, I would suggest, is that we're trying to think, well, why was Sophocles presenting this in the way he did? He wasn't trying to be specifically didactic and teaching you something, which some poems are from the ancient world. But in the telling of the myths, the telling of the tragedies, the poets and playwrights were sort of raising issues and raising questions. And so that ode, although it in one sense is a brilliant paean to how man is so wonderful, it's counterpointed by the next episode when man is shown to be an absolute horrendous thing. So that there's never a simple explanation there. So that's why I would say that the detailed work is important, but ultimately it's about the simplicity. And what is the question we're being asked, which is normally, how do we be human? So I think so long as the works, in a sense, are replicating that basic question, I would say that is faithful enough. That would be my perspective on it.
So Marcus, you're actually dealing with this play So, how would you answer that question?
I think that this is a bit like, if you imagine the work that we do, I'm speaking as a director here, the work we do is a bit like adding a piece of glass to a stained glass window, of which you have a picture in your head, of which is the various texts and translations and other productions you've seen and books and additional reading you've read and movies you've seen. We will put a different bit of glass into that window, which is a different piece of the palette, which helps to create and shape some of that picture. That's what we do. And if it's right, it should fit in there, it should be able to shine through and make some great colour and some great addition to the actual overall window as it grows over time. We can't produce everything, because when I directed one of the first adaptations of Lord of the Flies, there were some bits in there which of course were never going to be the same as the book, but what it did do was unlock people's ability to be able to go and see that, or to revisit the text, or to go and revisit for themselves. It was an opportunity for us to throw something into the space that people would then go, oh, I'd never thought of it like that. So it actually throws up something new. So for us, it really isn't a trying to be, it's not, you know, very similitude, or the kind of trying to do it as if you're doing a science experiment and you add the ingredients in. And we know when we're doing cooking, it's the same thing, that, you know, we can all follow a Delia recipe, but we'll all come up with a different sort of cake, because it just is. It's not a science, this is an art, and so therefore there's an ability, we have our own way of making it. So it really is something that we shouldn't feel that we should be too sacred about it, and we should be too frightened of baking some bits because it might not fit. We might get the shape of the glass wrong and it might not fit in the window, but that's the risk we take. But we have to go for it and help to build up the palette of the stuff that already exists. And that's really the difference between a director and a writer, because we want to still make those creative solutions that are going to be relevant to audiences now. And if we don't get it relevant to audiences now, and people say it's absolutely spot on for precision, then what does that actually mean? So we have to be able to communicate and to connect, and that's our always having in our mind, who is this for and why are we doing it, is the driving force for me in terms of delivering a piece of work for on stage and live for an audience.
But we very much personally enjoyed your reference to Politodena, which is one of the great high points of Western literature as far as I'm concerned, so thank you.
It will be in our play outside.
I did see a hand in this part of the room, if you'd still like to ask a question. Yes, could you wait for the mic? Thank you.
We know that the Greek society was a society which was multicultural. Yes, the slaves were there, although they don't figure a lot in many of the productions. I'm just wondering how you try to address audiences with multi-stranded lives. Black people, how do you attract them to those plays? How do you address that issue in your adaptations?
I would say there's probably one simple way through casting, right? I don't know if you want to speak to that, Sarah, or Mike, if I'm right. Who cast the lead in this play?
Actually, we did it together.
There you go.
Yeah.
Mike wrote a great stage direction. Some of my stage directions were challenging, but he wrote a really great stage direction, which was, I can't quote it exactly, but something along the lines of, I imagine an ensemble of, how did you say it, like? I imagine an ensemble, a contemporary ensemble of people of different nationalities, abilities, etc. Genders. Yes.
Oh, right, great, thank you.
This is one of the actors.
I have this out my script on hand. The mental picture I have is a group of battle-weary soldiers by the edge of the sea. They are the gods, but they are also everything and everybody else. In my mind, they look very now, but they also have a timelessness about them. This group of old soldiers could be a mix of genders, races, and abilities.
So Mike wrote that, and then Lucy, who's our BBC fellow who directed Penelope, in her feedback on the first draft, said to me, one of the things that excites me the most is that the ensemble can be so fresh and now in a way that we don't see it. Now, if truth be told, I don't think we've gone far enough, actually. And that is probably down to time, mainly. But we did make a conscious effort, and I was asked by somebody, would you like to see actors actors, non-white actors, for the role of Odysseus? And my reply was, yeah, why wouldn't I? And in fact, we ended up casting Wally Sawyer, an Afro-Caribbean actor, in the main role, because he's brilliant, actually. But I am pleased that we also then are developing the diversity of voices that we have on our stage. Mike works a lot with Jenny Seeley at Grey Eye, and she's a good friend of mine and a massive influence on me. Threatening Opera that's on at Nottingham House at the moment, I urge you to go and see. Because I think there is that challenge, actually. And I think if we were to do it again, we would try and be bolder and have more time to be bolder. And it does come down to time, I think, in the casting. Although the cast we have are brilliant. But yeah, and we were asking for a lot of things. We needed musicians, we needed storytellers, we needed actors, we needed people who were good at education because of our learning remit here. So we ask a lot of things of our actors, a lot of things. But I think if you go into it with the idea that this is theatre, anybody can play anything. And, you know, just in the same way that I'm not going to cast a real Cyclops, I'm not going to the fact that Odysseus is black and Telemachus isn't, and neither is his mother, and probably, you know, that wasn't possible, and all those things actually doesn't matter, and Derby audiences have embraced that.
Okay, the first word of the Odyssey is Andra. Andra means man. Andra moi anape musai or whatever. This is a story about a man, it starts. And Odysseus, you make plain, is a kind of everyman.
Yeah.
Could a woman have carried the weight of every person? Would you have conceivably cast a woman?
Yeah. Yeah, I would. Yeah.
So why didn't you?
It's a good question. I think because of Mike's adaptation. I think because I mean, originally part 1 was called The Men and part 2 was called The Women. And we do have, and there is, you know, at the moment, or recently, there has been that trend to have, you know, all female Shakespeare's and all of that. And I don't know, where do I sit on that? I find them, you know, sometimes I get really frustrated. I think Propeller's work's brilliant, but I get really frustrated because I go, why?
Propeller does all male
Shakespeare's, and I go, why are you just giving all men work again? I don't know what. So why didn't I do it in this? I guess because I didn't challenge my brain enough. I didn't challenge myself enough, and maybe I need to knock those walls down. I suppose that my response to that was to commission Penelope retold, and was to you know, because the company is 8, or originally actually the company was 7, and it's a fairly equal mix between men and women, and the women are very strong, and Mike writes a very strong Penelope, and there is no fairy tale ending to our Odyssey. She does not welcome him back into her bed immediately. That is left very much in a moment of tension. So I suppose that I felt that we'd told that story.
In fact, one of the advantages of Greek theatre to court is that there are so many great parts for women, in fact, when you think of Clytemnestra, etc. But thank you. Any more do you want to leap in?
Just to say that in answer to your question, sir, I think that the audiences we want to see in our buildings and spaces should be reflected by the people we have on our stages of making the work. It's very simple as that. That's what it is. It's a very simple answer to your question, you know, because it's a very good question, and it's something that, you know, who do you want to see in your buildings? What work are you going to make?
And I do think that the Antigone poster, which is a strong female black image, I think that will have an impact in the same way that actually as soon as we released the publicity shots with Wally in those shots, that did have an impact on the diversity of our audience for the good, I think.
So this figure is pre-casting. It's not a conspiracy. Pretending that you had a white Odysseus.
He's actually an actor, a very fine actor called James French. It was pre-script actually. It was when we just had an idea that we wanted to do the Odyssey, and we went, what does Odysseus look like? And the design company said, he looks a bit like this, and we went, yeah, he does.
There are many Odysseus's. Any more questions from the... There's a question down here, if you could wait for the microphone. Thank you.
More to do with classics. I came here because I'm a classicist. I go to anything and everything to do with classics, which is why I went to see The Odyssey and Penelope Untold and any other play. But it amazes me how popular the subject is these days. When I studied it at university, there were about 10 in our department at Nottingham, and now I've read in the Classical Association thing about 400 undergraduates and 30 postgraduates. I'm just totally amazed by it, and I wondered, why do you think it is so popular? I mean, you wouldn't put on plays if you didn't think you were going to get an audience. And I'm just in my element now. So.
Emma, is this something that you experience in your own working life? That students are flocking to Manchester?
I think we have seen an increase in the popularity of the subjects generally, partly to do with changes in education. That it used to be for a long time that classical studies was seen as something that was privileged, and Sarah was talking about how these stories really should be the birthright of every child born into our societies. And I think we've made a lot of progress in that respect in giving people access to education, to storytelling, so that people will come to see these productions. They maybe won't want to go on and do a degree in ancient Greek, but it will somehow affect their lives, and sometimes people circle round and come back to it even in retirement. So I think that there has been an increased access to the material. Also, I think it's part of a general instability in the world, that life has become more scary, and we see it's more scary because we've got Twitter and we've got the internet. And so all of these wars that are going on are very close to us, even though we're feeling safe. So in our daily lives, we feel this problem of closeness and distance that people have been talking about, that we feel everything's over there and yet it's affecting me. So I think one reason people are drawn to this area of study is as a sort of a safe space in which to try to deal with these day-to-day issues, quite apart from the fact that sometimes these stories are told the best way they could have been told. I'm not talking about the Odyssey, I'm not talking about Antigone, but sometimes the ancient versions maybe are as good as you're going to get, and so people are drawn towards that. But I think more and more it's to do with access and education being more open, which I think is only a good thing.
And a bit to do, I think it's a bit to do with theatre being so open to these ancient texts. You know, people coming to the classics now through places like this, and that's a kind of great thing for, that's a wonderful thing for classicists, obviously. I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute to that, or whether we should see if there's another hand in the audience. Yes, if you could wait for that, Caroline.
It's a question for Mike, really. I feel like I've got a really quite a good handle on Penelope now, with Caroline's adaptation or version, and as Sarah says, with such a strong Penelope in the piece, in the Odyssey. What do you think about Odysseus, is what I'd like to know.
Damn good question.
Comes across as quite patchy sometimes.
Would you go
quite what?
Quite patchy.
Quite patchy?
Yeah, when he's leaving the Cyclops and he's shouting his abuse, I think, oh, you dickhead.
Yeah.
So I just wondered what you thought of it.
Yeah, no, Odysseus has no bed. Yes, he's actually referred to in the original as tricky. You know, he's a trickster. You can't quite trust him. Yeah, a man of trouble. He is a troubled man, but clever as well. Actually, this is my personal thing. Actually, it was interesting, Caroline talking about her reaction to her partner's absence. I don't know why, but until I started work on this, I hadn't registered that I was the son of an absent father who was in the army when I was born. At the beginning of the 50s, my dad was a career soldier, and he'd been in the army in the war, but stayed on because of the Korean War. So he didn't actually come home properly until I was 3. So I was a kind of classic Telemachus. This man suddenly arrived in the house. You know, kind of, he was there off and on bringing toys, and I've still got these kind of odd German dollies that you wind up and they kind of bounce about, that were totally inappropriate because they were either too old or they were for the, you know, they had no recognition of who I was. So from that point on, when he came home, and he came home because my mother had a nervous breakdown, basically, because we were living 3 families in a small house, which was a tied house that my grandparents lived. So I hadn't realised until I was in the middle of this that actually I had a very personal relationship to these, you know, this person. And my dad was a Manx Scally who then went on to work in the gasworks, and he was inconsistent, shall we say, you know, a great singer, a good laugh, and had real temper on him. And that went into, you know, like, yeah, he's a hero, but also he can't quite resist, you know, taking on, yeah, come on, you know. I think that's why he's like he is. And I kind of felt like that was the story that I was telling on a personal level, out of all the many versions, you know. I mean, one of the great things about these Greek archetypes is that you project quite a lot onto them. In some ways they are quite, you know, vague, and they're what they do as much as what they think and feel. And what, you know, Odysseus does, well, I was selective, but, you know, so that's kind of it.
That's so interesting, the lack of interiority and the, sorry, yeah, what were you
I was just going to say, from a classicist point of view, what would you add to that? Because that's really interesting to hear your kind of personal take on it. Would you, you know, could you paint the picture of Odysseus from a classicist perspective?
I was actually going to ask Emma about the 2 Odysseus's, because the Iliad Odysseus is completely different from the Odysseus of the Odyssey, and that's quite an instructive sort of dichotomy, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question about, you know, how should we relate to Odysseus, is he a great hero, is something that the original audiences of Sophocles' Antigone were well aware of. They were probably asking the same question. They knew these stories, they knew the Odyssey, the Iliad very well, and yet there were all these contradictions. And ironically, when Odysseus turns up in Greek tragedy, and it was described at the time that Sophocles was using scraps from Homer's banquet, so there's a lot of connections there. But when Odysseus turns up in Greek tragedy, he's not a nice character at all. And the morality of the world has changed a little bit, and he's now seen as being quite a disreputable character. And yet, I think in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's still an openness about him, and perhaps an acceptance of that, as a character who has suffered. He didn't want to go and fight the Trojan War. He was a reluctant participant. He does what he can when he's there, and then he wants to get home, and he resists all sort of blandishments, and he still is committed to his family and his wife. So even though when he gets home, I'm sure he is a bit of a bastard, he still has the underlying good motivations. And so I think it's quite interesting that, you know, the Greek audiences of tragedy had these problems with him as a character, in the same way that I think we can today. But very often our personal feelings colour the way we see these things.
He comes to represent, in later plays, a kind of manipulative use of rhetoric, which the seeds of which are already there in Homer, because he's a tricksy man who tells lies and can use his articulate nature to get out of any scrape. By the time we get on to certain Greek tragedies, that is being used, a kind of persuasion that's wrong or unpleasant or negative or manipulative in a grotesque way, in plays like Ajax or...
Yes, I mean, Ajax shows us 2 sides of two sides of Odysseus. Again, that he starts off as the villain, and then at the end he's the one who relents and says, actually, we must bury Ajax in that case, same issue as in Antigone. And yet in other plays like Sophocles' Philoctetes, again put on same time as Antigone, Odysseus is just an out-and-out career politician. He's willing to say anything to get what he wants. So I think it's interesting that the Greek audiences were concerned about these problems, about the character and about his morality, but perhaps they were not so worried as we are about pinning him down. They were more open to the flexibility, and you talked about the sinuous nature of myths, and that they were able to sort of see characters as having good and bad features and accept them as rounded, whole human beings rather than just ideal heroes.
And the Odysseus of the Iliad is brutal, and you know he's a sort of intelligence expert. So he with his mate goes out and captures a Trojan, Dolon, extracts intelligence from him, and then in return they say for setting him free, and then they slit his throat. I mean this is really brutal. In the Odyssey, he does gain this sort of wonderful mellifluous charm, I think, that he lacks in the Iliad. But already he's an unstable character. As you say, Mike, he's there for us to project upon, and that's okay. But I wonder, Caroline, did you have, Odysseus is not present, but he's the elephant in your bed. Did you build up a character, a sort of absent character for Odysseus? How did it work when you were making?
I think, as I mentioned before, my point of departure was when he leaves for the second time, which, even just thinking about it leaves me sort of gobsmacked. But I was really keen as well that we on some level understand her mix of feelings for him. So he couldn't just be this awful beast who had done X, Y, and Z to her. I think I had to invest in this idea that she was still there. She was still in this dilemma. She hadn't gone. And in the world that mine is sort of set in, that she could have gone. I wanted there to be a feeling that there'd been a love story. I mentioned in the piece that I've made that he didn't want to go. He tried to get out of it, and that there is a moment where Penelope describes the goodbye, and it's really, I wanted that to feel like a really painful thing, that she was saying goodbye to this person that she loved and who was her life and the father of her child and all of that, but then living directly alongside that because of the amount of time he's been absent, and the pain that she has gone through is this hatred. So I really wanted the two like smacking up against each other, and that happens in the bit at the end, which Lucy and I particularly kept changing. This is the bit I kept changing, but eventually ended up with this thing where she just has this complete sort of breakdown at the end, this tirade where she rips up the bed, but then smacked into the middle of that is a little passage about the longing for him, but we found it in an improvisation where I carried on through it in the same tone. So she's still sort of tearing at the bed. She's still in this place of like, if you were back here now, I would feel like I would rip you up. But she's actually saying, I want you so much back here now. And so, in terms of a specific picture of someone, I guess it's elements of different beings, certainly from my life, from elements that I get from the Homer, this idea of these absent soldier husbands that I felt like I'd got pictures of from the research that I'd done. So he does exist, but he's an amalgamation of lots of different things. Another collage.
Can I pick up that collage point? Because I think that it's actually there in the Odyssey that, as you said, there are so many different stories. Penelope has heard so many different versions of when Odysseus is coming back. Is he dead? Something's happened. Should I do this? But when he comes back, she doesn't know who he is. And in a sense, all she's left with are those conflicting emotions.
Yeah.
So I think that although you're telling it as a separate additional story, it's actually just sort of unpacking something which Homer, for whatever reason, didn't choose to give you in as much detail. So very Homeric in itself.
This is very, very Homeric. I completely agree. Any more? There's a hand here.
Hi, thanks. Would you agree that there's a danger when working with the adaptations of Greek theatre and Homer not to take too literalist a slant on the characters portrayed in the play? Because I mean, I've read the Bacchae by Euripides, and I've very much given the impression that it's like a choral theatre. It's like a legend or spoken theatre rather than it's like these are not maybe the exact things that the characters said on stage, or the dithyramb or the chorus, but actually more it's more of a legend. And I think there's a danger when working with these plays to become too locked into thinking, well, he said that and he did this, and actually that's the wrong way to work with Greek theatre. Well, that's my question. Okay, for Mike or Caroline.
Mike, do you want to start?
Yes. It's another one of those big questions that lives with you all the time when you're working with this stuff, I think. Actually, the Bacchae is a great example, because I think that the way, and a great play for our time, the way, the kind of Apollo and Dionysus are like archetypes that we all have within us, and if you try and destroy that kind of urge for ecstasy and joy, it gets destructive, and mothers will rip their heads off their sons, and I think that is very hard to reduce to domestic naturalism, really. It's very, in fact, I think it's a wonderful play, I love it, but I don't think I've ever seen it work on stage. I kind of feel like nobody's got me to that point, because actually, although we understand it, humans embodying it struggle to get to that place. I don't know. I feel like I tried to pitch the language in a place that was poetic without being poetic. Do you know what I mean? And that's partly, I think, as I'm a playwright. Going back to the earlier question about Antigone, it happens with Shakespeare as well as the Greeks, as whether they're the poet versus the playwright, And the playwright in me thinks Antigone, say, is a great play because every single character that comes onto that stage changes the reality. It's beautifully said, but I think the thing that makes it great is that it's constructed like the most perfect piece of theatrical engineering. I think there's a problem with over reducing stuff, but I still think, oh dear, sorry, I keep running it. These are such big questions, aren't they? And we don't resolve them. We get as far as we can get. That's what I think. Sorry.
I think I think there's something about language and size that I don't know whether I have or not, but that I wanted to try and honour. Something I kept saying to Lucy, I was like, don't let me make a domestic drama. Don't let me. Like, I didn't want it to be naturalistic. I thought a lot about big images and thought a lot about Beckett. I thought a lot about, his characters, for me, they have that epic tragedy in a way that some of the Greek stuff does, because there seems to be this outside force that sticks them in a situation, and we just have to watch them. And I wanted that to feature in Penelope, sort of alongside the bits where I'm like doing a sort of vicious go at sort of, we're really happy military wives, isn't it great? But so maybe I haven't done that, maybe I have just reduced it in some way, but that feeling of the epicness of the language, of this situation where a character is stuck and we just have to watch them stuck, I think that was an element of that bigness that I was keen to have a presence in what I was making.
I ask about literalism in a slightly different way, which is that according to the conventions of classical drama as we have them, in other words, in the plays that survive, what we don't have are moments where men get turned into pigs on stage.
True.
Or there are stage directions, because there aren't any stage directions reading, he rips his head off and flings it to the ground, which are both sort of slightly reworded stage directions.
No, that's pretty much what.
In Night's Play, and I was reading the text of Mo's post, such a joy, because you can just feel the mischief in him leaving this massive, great problem to be solved. Because that's the thing about the Odyssey is a poem of fantastic special effects that can all be done in the brain. Sarah, how did you cope with having to make them happen on the stage with a cast of 8 and twopence halfpenny?
I remember the audition actually, and which probably the design wasn't ready or anything, and we workshopped that bit. And I remember saying in the audition to the actors, so that'll be the challenge when we get in the room. How do we make the head fall off one of you? I suppose it's about, so just some very practical things. The way that we do the pigs is that Cersei has stockings, and they peel the stockings off and they come over the head as if they're drinking, and that's what turns them into pigs. Sorry to spoil that if any of you haven't seen the show.
How the hell did you come up with that?
Just through conversation, I suppose. We kind of, Barney and I talked about what's at the core of this. What is it? What are we trying to say about why Cersei turns the men into pigs? We went back to Cersei's history, about the idea that we came up with this idea that the Cersei scene to us came back to this idea that she had been blighted by many men. This was our interpretation of it. And that actually the relationship between Cersei and Odysseus in this scene, in our play, in our version, is that we read it as two, I hope I don't offend anyone here, two kind of emo goths who sit each other and go, we're not really right for each other, but we're both so depressed that we're just going to sink into this relationship together and have sex and drink and have all these things because it's just, we can feel each other's pain. And that's the modern adaptation that we got to through reading, researching, having a conversation, blah, 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 blah. And that the other men don't have that ultimate connection underneath, and so they fall for the wily ways. They fall for the way she looks and the sexuality of her and all of that. But actually, what connects Odysseus to her is this core of pain that they both live in. And so what Odysseus does is he rips the stocking off and he's there. Equally with the sirens, for us, you know, it's not about the sirens being seductive and sexy and luring them in. It's actually about what is Odysseus wanting more than anything, and it's inner peace. And when you talk to the soldiers, a lot of the research that we did, not only from Dr. Jonathan Shays, but also the conversations we had, was about how can I have the conversation with anybody about what I have seen. So we spoke to an ex-Royal Marine who talked about, in very brave terms, about how he saw someone and their stomach was shot out and he had to put it back in. And I said, and did they live? And he just went, no. But that was it. You know, he was, you know, and this man is, he's an amazing man. And he's gone through all of that. But what he also talks about is he said, you know, don't ask me to talk about that. How can I begin to have those conversations? So the sirens became for us about actually an offer of peace. And so our siren is a male. And it is spoken word. with some beautiful singing by Anna behind it. So I suppose it's about looking at, yeah, sometimes it is just a theatrical how do we do that. So when the Cyclops bites off the people's heads, we went through all manner of things. We tried blood, right up until the opening night, we had blood capsules left, right and centre. And I suppose what we went back to was actually, what are we? We're theatre makers. We're not filmmakers, we're theatre makers. So let's not pretend, because actually an actor's going to get up and play another part in a minute. You're going to know that he's not there. So let's not pretend. And also, because of not only Mike's writing, but because it is the oldest story ever told, you can allow your audience to suspend their disbelief. And you can say to your audience, we're telling you a story and you are engaging in this in the same way, and there is no fourth wall, so let's see what happens. And the audience go on us. Interestingly, with the Cyclops episode, people still gasp. At the moment where he breaks his neck and there's a sound effect on the violin, the audience still go, even though we quite clearly haven't broken his neck. And then the Cyclops eats his head through eating the helmet, and he quite clearly isn't eating his head because his head's still on the actor. But people still gasp because, and sometimes it's really easy in theatre, and I think Pilot do this really well actually, that even though they put all of the digital stuff around it and they take us somewhere else technologically, but it's still about the truth of those characters and the truth of that story. And in theatre, we're there to make stories. And also, very clever man called Jeremy Stockwell always says, and I quote it all the time in both my rehearsals and when I work with young people, it's called a play because that's what you're supposed to do, play. So just play, enjoy. And if you can enjoy the audience in that engagement and that sense of play, then actually, that's better than any film, I think.
Hooray for theatre. Now, we might be moving gently towards the end of this session. If anybody is burning to ask something, I have this wonderful feeling that Sarah's paean to the power of theatre may have been a really great place to finish, which just leaves me to thank very much our terrific panel. Caroline, I think, has already performed this morning and will be performing later tonight. Extremely long day. But a special thanks to you as the most wonderfully engaged and terrific audience with a mass of challenging and great questions. And I feel very optimistic, and I feel very passionately that, you know, as I say, the Greeks are among us and we're among the Greeks. These are stories for now, and theatre, you know, experiencing them in our theatres is our birthright. So, thank you very much indeed. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you to Charlotte for hosting and for chairing in a way that I think we've all felt included. So thank you all.